Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us from the True Stories collection. Amy goes to draw for her turn, while Nick controls Sheoldred the Apocalypse. Nick makes no mention of the Sheoldred's triggered ability, so Amy moves on to play a Consider. After fully resolving the Consider and putting it into her graveyard, Nick says, "Oh yeah, you lose 2 life because you drew from the Consider. Actually, you also should have lost 2 more life because you drew for the turn." At this point, Amy says that Nick has missed those triggers and calls for a judge. What is the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix? Okay, so I first want to talk about regular rel because it's a lot less interesting than competitive rel in this situation, so I wanted to get it out of the way first. I would basically always give both triggered abilities to Nick, and the reason is because there hasn't really been a whole lot of game actions that happened since the triggered ability should have happened, so I think that it's probably the most fair way to do it if you would just give those triggered abilities to him. I'm going to expand a lot on this when I talk about how this works at competitive rel, so if that doesn't feel 100% right to you, then definitely take a consideration about what I'm about to say and see if you feel the same way at the end of the episode. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about how this would work at competitive rel. And this is going to be a lot more interesting of a scenario because competitive rel is a lot more formalized about what you can and can't do, and the lines about whether a triggered ability should or should not be granted to a player are a lot more formalized. So with that being the case, I would say conclusively that you definitely would be giving Nick the triggered ability for losing 2 life as a result of the Consider draw. This is because at the point where the triggered ability should go on the stack, that's exactly when Nick brought it up, immediately after the Consider finishes resolving. There hasn't been any game actions that happened whatsoever in between the time when that triggered ability should be going on the stack and when Nick specifically said that it should be going on the stack. So that one I would definitely be giving to him in all cases. Now that we've talked about that, let's analyze the other triggered ability, the one from where Amy drew from her draw step. And this one is a lot more interesting. So in order to see exactly whether this triggered ability was missed or not, we're going to need to know exactly when the Consider was played. And the reason for that is the bar for when you need to remember a triggered ability is in general when it affects the visible game state. So with the case of the Sheoldred triggered ability that we're talking about, that is when this triggered ability resolves. That is the point where it changes the visible game state by affecting the life total of one of the players. So with that being the case, we need to know whether we have moved past the point where that triggered ability has resolved or not. And that is something that's not exactly 100% clear cut. So it's certainly possible that Amy would have played that Consider during her main phase, at which point we're definitely past the point where the triggered ability from her draw step would have resolved. On the other hand, it's also a 100% perfectly legal play that Amy could have made for her to respond to the triggered ability in her draw step by playing the Consider. Now, we know what Amy was probably thinking about when she played that Consider. However, in the absence of any communication, then there really isn't any way for us to know for sure whether Amy played that Consider during her main phase or during her draw step with the Sheoldred trigger still on the stack. Because Amy didn't make any sort of communication to the contrary, it's ambiguous as to which of these two states the game is actually in. And we also have this guiding principle here from the IPG, which says that triggered abilities are always assumed to be remembered unless we have some sort of concrete evidence to the contrary. Because we don't have any sort of evidence like this in this situation, the correct ruling for the judge would be to say that this triggered ability could still be on the stack at the point when Nick pointed it out, and because that's the case, Nick is entitled to this triggered ability also. I can think of one other situation where this principle came up and it was really important to know. If you were playing Standard several years ago and you wanted to counter a Demigod of Revenge, here's a pro tip. Make sure you mention that you're playing the counterspell after its cast trigger has resolved. Otherwise, your opponent is 100% within their rights to say that you played the counterspell with that cast trigger on the stack, and then they'll just return the Demigod that you just countered to the battlefield when that trigger resolves. Obviously not the play that you're going for, but that's the way that the rules work, based on the policy documents that we have written right now. Okay, so if you're Amy, you're probably not super pleased with how this has gone down. So let's take a little bit of time to analyze some stuff that she might be able to do in order to help this situation end up a little bit more in her favor. One idea would be if she just asks Nick if the triggered ability is on the stack. If he says no, then, well, hey, the triggered ability is not on the stack anymore. And it's pretty conclusive evidence that he should not be able to get her to lose 2 life. Of course, this is not a really great idea for Amy from her point of view because, well, obviously if you just ask Nick if the triggered ability that he controls is on the stack, then he's going to say yes, and he's almost assuredly going to remember the next time that triggered ability triggers when you play the consider. So that's not a super great way to go if you're Amy. Another thing that you could do would be to make some sort of communication that we are acting in a time when that triggered ability has already resolved. Now, there's a couple of ways to do this, and it doesn't have to be as direct as what we just talked about, where you just ask if the triggered ability is still on the stack or not. So, for example, it's not possible to play a land if there's a triggered ability on the stack. And so that would mean that if Amy plays a land and then plays the consider, or plays some other sorcery speed spell and then the consider, well, it's not possible at all for that play to work with the interpretation of Nick having the triggered ability still on the stack. Since it's impossible to play a sorcery or a land with that triggered ability on the stack, the judge would be forced to conclude that we are indeed acting in Amy's main phase, and that means that the triggered ability has conclusively been missed. Or Amy could just say specifically that she's playing the consider during her main phase. Just saying something as simple as main phase consider, well, that would mean that she's acting in the main phase. And if Nick doesn't specifically say at that point that there's a triggered ability on the stack that she needs to deal with first, well, that would mean that that triggered ability has been missed since we progressed past the point where we're in the draw step and into a different phase. Again, it's not possible to go to the main phase if there's still a triggered ability on the stack. Now, with all that being the case, I saw a lot of people online talking about this exact situation, and there were a lot of calls for policy to change and a lot of people saying that it was broken. Now, I'm not really sure that I agree with all of that. In fact, in my opinion, this is policy working exactly the way that it's supposed to. And why do I say that? Well, let's think about things from Nick's point of view for a second here. If you have a Sheoldred, then you have the right to reduce your opponent's life total by 2 every time they draw a card. Now, if you're Amy, you don't have to help Nick to claim that right. But it's also the case that you're not allowed to use your play patterns or your timing or ambiguity in the game to deprive Nick of his ability to claim that right. And so with that being the case, we have a really delicate balance that we have to strike in between both of these two players' interests. Because the player who's actively progressing the game state has the most control over the flow of the game, we balance that out by giving the most possible benefit of the doubt for whether a triggered ability is on the stack based on what stuff has happened in the game. In this way, both players' competing interests are balanced. I want to make it very clear, we are not giving one player any extra opportunities to put triggered abilities on the stack that they wouldn't have otherwise had. Rather, we're just giving them the most charitable, most possible benefit of the doubt among all the game states that could potentially exist based on the communication that happened in between the players in the actual game, verbal and nonverbal alike. I also want to kind of point out that this sort of arrangement is definitely going to have some possibilities where a player forgets about their triggered ability and then remembers it later. The infraction is called missed trigger, not forgotten trigger. Based on the rules and the policy documents that we have in Magic, if you forget about a trigger and then remember it, as long as you remember it by the cutoff time that's defined in the IPG, that's the point where you have to demonstrate awareness of the trigger. If you had previously forgotten about that triggered ability and then remember it later, as long as you remember it by the time of that cutoff, then you're in the clear. That's the line that we have, and that's the line that all of the rest of the policy and philosophy is based around. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.